Sorry about that. There we go. Okay, apologies everyone. All right, let me jump back into this. Again, my name is Dan Erstad. I'm the Chief Growth Officer at Monument. Monument is an online treatment platform that's designed to help anyone cut back or quit drinking alcohol. One of the things that we're really proud to do is create a forum for conversation. And a way that we do that is through these Monument Live sessions. Over time, we've had a number of different speakers, but we're really proud to have Richard Deming on today to talk about his own experiences in recovery. And also we'll focus a little bit on his book. So before we turn it over to Richard to get started, I'll very quickly read his bio so everyone has some background on Richard. So Richard Deming is a poet, art critic, and theorist whose work explores the intersections of poetry, philosophy, and visual culture. His collection of poems, Let's Not Call It Consequence, received the 2009 Norma Farber Award from the Poetry Society of America. His work has been featured in many leading publications, and he teaches at Yale University, where he is the director of creative writing. He is also the author of multiple books, including This Exquisite Loneliness, What Loners, Outcasts, and the Misunderstood Can Teach Us About Creativity, published in 2023. And this is going to be the main focus of our conversation today. So thank you so much, Richard, for being here. Before we do get to the book, I think I'd love to just jump into your journey a little bit more, being in recovery and first share that with the Monument community.
Sure, Dan. No, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really glad to have this opportunity to talk to folks. Yeah, so where would you like me to begin?
I mean, I think maybe it's good to have a bit of background. So I discovered the book through an excerpt that was written where you talked about the intersection of Philip Seymour Hoffman's unfortunate passing, and you started to talk about the very personal experience or the connections that you made to your journey growing up. But I think it'd be great to share a little bit of background with our members about how unfortunately alcohol entered your life, and just give a little bit of context as to kind of your road to recovery.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, I started I think drinking and using when I was about 14. And it went very quickly into, being a pretty bad thing. And I was somebody who figured out early that if I kept people from knowing, I could do it a lot more. Because if I let people know, then I would get, shut down. And so I got very good at hiding it from people, even at 15, 16, coming to school drunk and or high. I started becoming a blackout drinker when I was 15, I think was the first time, and then I became pretty regular and using everything I could get my hands on. Yeah, I mean, that was really, it made a lot of, I was able to do a certain amount of things, while I was doing that. I was pretty good at maintaining myself, again, to knowing that I was hiding even though a lot of times I was blackout drunk and would, I talk a little bit about this in the book, like there were times that I would wake up states away, or I woke up in Canada. I'm from Boston. I woke up in Canada, in a alley behind a bar, my face covered in blood. Yeah, I was 19 when I got into rehab, and a lot of it, to be honest, I was forced into it. Because I got pulled over 27 times between the age of 16 and 20. And the last one is the one that they really were like, we're going to throw away the key kind of thing. And I had been driving in a blackout and had been driving the wrong way down a major interstate. And yeah, and I woke up basically in the jail cell. And so then that, led to all the processes that got me into rehab, which, at the time I fought, but everybody else was pretty clear that that was where I should be. And, the and it was the right decision. I mean, there was no way around it. I, came from, I had been in my family, and so it was something that I had largely, partly inherited, and also it was just my temperament. And yeah, then I got out, and it was just having to relearn all the things that had gotten me to that place. And, some of it, and, sort of anticipating the conversation of the day, was because I had been lonely from a very young age. And it was, there was all sorts of reasons that I did it, but largely, and I only came to this through hindsight, was realizing that a primary problem was my feeling lonely so often and so deeply. And it was a way of my sort of managing that really intense pain of loneliness that caused me to drink and use.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And you're already starting to segue into some of the questions and about loneliness and the connection, and the themes of the book. But I wonder if, going back even earlier, before we do get to the book itself, if you start to think about that path to recovery and the early stage of your career, maybe you could comment on kind of as you were going through those steps, and how that kind of propelled you to become a creative and a writer, and those different things in your career.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that like I had turned to music and art relatively, was really pretty early. I started playing, I would start out as a musician. I probably should say that. I started out as a musician, and I got some attention that way, because I was good at it. And it also just helped me sort of again navigate that loneliness, and also came this I mean, the drinking and the substance abuse really allowed me to do that, and allowed me to play that role. And also, I mean, I was interested in classical jazz, but also rock and roll, and really liked, I was really introverted, but like to be a musician. And I was a drummer, but still like to be like extroverted and to like kind of hustle the way I needed to. I really needed to like push myself out of that introversion, and the drugs and alcohol allowed me to do that. But at the same time, like there's just like I think finding a creative outlet is a way of also, managing that intensity. Like, I think, it's an interesting thing. Do you turn to the arts because you're that way, or are you that way because you turned towards the arts? And I think that like um, one writing the book, so this is later, and I hope it's not jumping around too much, but like later, like it gives me a sense of like what you're asking about early, and like later writing the book and thinking about it, I realized that, well, one, that it took me years to realize how much loneliness had been part of that early part of it as well. But also that like what came in writing the book and thinking about it was how um creating things is a way of not just like, for some people it's like therapeutic and expressing, and like you get it out of your system. But I think that like for loneliness, and even whatever I was feeling, it was a way of um calling out to people. I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess I would say that like part of what creating anything is, no matter what field, is vulnerability. And you make yourself vulnerable. And I think that like I think that's true. It's funny. I never thought of it this way, but I think that like that was part of it. Like I was creating stuff because I was feeling lonely, and having and creating a space for vulnerability in my life, but was so scared of that impulse that like that would be the drugs and alcohol is the way to like, steel myself to do this thing and throw myself into what I needed to do. And yet at the same time, it's also the thing that like completely shut me off from it and only just made the loneliness that much worse. And so like it becomes this sort of like arms race, like, wanting to create and wanting to be vulnerable, feeling vulnerable, and yet using the drugs and alcohol to propel you forward. But then it gets harder to experience that. And of course you're chasing, or I was chasing everybody else away from me, or like just, descending into like roaming the streets of Boston alone, drunk, um, asking people what time it was just to have some sense of somebody saying something to me. So it's this weird, like, you know, using the one thing to survive, but then it becomes the very thing that's killing me. And yet, like, then that to survive that pain, I need more of it. And like I said, it's just this arms race that just kept going until I couldn't do it anymore. And really, for me, I had to switch from music, ultimately from music to writing, because the music was just I couldn't find a different way to do it and survive myself. And people say, "Why did you leave music school?" And I said, "Because I wouldn't have survived myself." It just fueled the wrong parts of me, and that writing was always much more positive. So I think that's part of it too. It's just finding the same activity, but like a different feel to it, so that it does the good thing, but isn't completely contaminated by all the
Right.
stuff that kind of ruined it before.
Yeah, that's really powerful. The idea, music being somewhat of something you maybe had to sacrifice for your own well-being and good, but still finding another creative outlet. So I want to shift over to the book and talk more about it. Just one mention, a plug. I did put into the chat a link to Richard's site where you can learn more about his works. And then if there are questions that anyone has in the webinar today, please put them in and we can try and address them through the conversation. But about the book, so it's you shared some of your personal experiences, and this book it's very personal. But can you talk just more about the genesis of it and kind of how the idea for this exquisite loneliness came about?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's the sense of the stakes, and you kind of alluded to it, which was writing this essay about this movie, Synecdoche, New York, which is the saddest movie I think I've ever seen. It's brilliant. It's brilliant, but it's really sad. And somebody had asked me to write about it. And I was in the middle of writing about it. And a friend of mine with whom I had gotten sober, I mean, years ago, um, wrote or called me and said, he's dead. And I said, who? And he said, Philip Seymour Hoffman, the guy you're writing about right now, just died. And so, my head was completely in this movie in which Philip Seymour Hoffman, who is just slightly older than I am, is playing someone who's really sad and really lonely. It's beautiful. And he's creative. He's a playwright in the movie too. And I think that was part of it. And he had the actor Hoffman had grown up outside Rochester, where I had that's where I went to music school, and like it had become kind of like a good, healthy place for me. And I had known people who had known him in high school, but I'd never met him. And I know people now who know him, and it would always seemed like I would meet him. And he had been, so we had understood him to be sober for a long time. And it turned out that he had been kind of, really struggling and going out again and using, and he dies of an overdose. And that's how he died. And to be sort of like, and he dies alone in an apartment, and like all his friends were really saying he had withdrawn. And it was in that moment, I think really thinking about loneliness, and then having that person who I kind of identified, I always called him the Marlon Brando of loneliness, that his death reminded me that there are real stakes to loneliness. It's not just like neediness or something that we should be ashamed of, but like people really die from it. And so that's where I really said, like, I was just talking to a student today about this, like what I wanted was to understand loneliness, like like when I write a book, it's because I want to try to figure something out, not solve it, but know it. And I think that's true, like even of my addictions. It's like I'm not cured of it. My job was to kind of figure out how it thinks so that I could stay out of, for me, that's how I think of it, and stay out of its path and be able to see where it's trying to run a game on me. And it's the same thing with loneliness. Like again, I still feel lonely. I have a great marriage. I have friends. I still get like really lonely, very chronically. And to really try to understand it, I thought I could be spared, the things that some other people who, didn't think through it or didn't think through its impact or didn't wrestle with its consequences or think about its stakes. I didn't want to end up like that. So I wanted to look at other people, think about it in my own life and look at other people's too, particularly other artists or thinkers or writers who knew that it was an issue for them and how they responded to it, thought through it, works, built something out of it, not despite it, but from those feelings. To again to kind of understand it and to reach out to others. I mean, ultimately that's the thing, like the interest in like creativity being tied to vulnerability is sort of like a broadcast of vulnerability that allows you to say to other people, this is what I want to be vulnerable to let other people in, and my being vulnerable to them hopefully allows them the possibility of opening themselves up to it as well, because that's the only way we receive these things, is being open to it.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting. And another idea, theme that comes up in the book, and I think it's central to it, is this idea of the stigma that can be attached both to addiction and to loneliness. I wonder if you could talk just a little bit more about that. And you did touch on this a little bit, but a little bit more of the stigma around loneliness and addiction. And I'd love to explore that topic a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting thing. And like when you start to do the research, like I kept running into people like therapists and analysts and healthcare workers who, didn't all say it, but a lot said it, which was that they had people, and I think this is absolutely true in my own life. They had people they worked with who would pretty quickly say, I'm a substance abuser. I, have problems with alcohol, or I'm depressive. I'm also depressive. And like they could say that, but loneliness was the thing that they would not say. Um, and it was, the studies are really starting to reveal it's because, depression, there's such clear links to, what we eat, how much we sleep, and just biological inheritance, what our body chemistry is. And so that, well, it doesn't make sense to be sort of ashamed of something we had no control over, like the chemicals that make up our body. So if there's a biological connection to it, well, then that helps destigmatize it. And I think that's true. That's true of depression, becoming very clear that addiction is linked to these things too. And so that like there is a way that people can understand it. I mean, it doesn't go away. I mean, it's still a risk saying these things, but loneliness doesn't yet we haven't located a gene that makes people feel lonely. And so people are very quick to um, see it as like a character flaw, a weakness. Like, isn't that just neediness? And people are reluctant to say, they can say, I need help for these other problems, but to say I need help because I feel lonely. I mean, it's even saying lone, like there's so much attached to it. Like it feels like we feel unloved or unconnected, and my saying it somehow proves that that's why. Because if I say I'm lonely, then I feel needy, and then nobody wants a person who's needy. So that like that's all the things that like sort of surround it. And something else that like kind of comes out too is that so often like when you go through your day, not everybody you talk to is a depressive. Not everybody you talk to has issues with addiction. Um, but most everybody you meet in a day has had some form of loneliness. And so if I stigmatize it and I don't want to talk about it in my own life, I don't want to hear about it from other people. And so that like even there, some instances where they're seeing, some psychoanalysts have talked about how therapists and analysts and psychologists themselves are sometimes reluctant to talk about it in their patients because they're trying to protect themselves from their own loneliness. So it becomes this like, so this like closed loop. And I think that one of the ways to really fight that is to like talk about it and say, yeah, I'm like the same thing like with addiction um or depression. Like it's so much a part of my life that why wouldn't I say it? And not hide from it. And in writing about loneliness, I thought, well, yeah, these are the stakes. Dying alone in an apartment. I don't want that. I'm gonna tell people. So at least I own it and
Yeah.
understand it.
One of the things we talk about at Monument is that there's a spectrum of how alcohol can impact each individual, and it's not a one size fits all or black and white or binary. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like, and from reading the book, loneliness also manifests in different ways. It's not the same for every individual. But maybe you could comment a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It does. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that it can, reveal itself or that people can identify it. And some of the, it's hard to say what some of the causes are. What I got more interested in was not like the circumstance. So there's a couple categories we can break down immediately, which is occasional or circumstantial loneliness. So, for instance, if I'm alone, suddenly working in a fire station in the Pacific Northwest, and I'm like at the tree line for a month, yeah, I'm going to feel lonely, and people will, and we understand that. Uh, but then there's also the chronic loneliness that has nothing to do with the circumstance, and it just keeps coming back, and feels like it's just a real distance. And I got more interested in thinking through like how do we deal with or how do we recognize chronic loneliness in our lives? And in fact, like because there's so much stigma, there gets to be a heavy denial, just the same as there is in like addiction or depression. And I wanted to look at different people and see the ways that it manifested itself in other people's lives. So that I would have different angles. Like if I just talk about my own loneliness, I'm just going to keep coming at it at the same level. But if I talk about it in terms of other people and how they came to it or how they realized it, I have a different picture of it all the time. And so like someone like Walker Evans is a the photographer, one of the most famous, influential photographers in America. And he, went to a prep school, but his parents divorced really early. And he becomes, alcoholic but later in life and ends up really dying mostly because of it, but it's a different like whereas mine was early, his was late. And so like where did his come from, and just learning to acknowledge it in our own lives. And I think this isn't like even theoretical. Like I had a few friends that said, "Oh, I'm interested in reading your book." I mean, I never feel lonely, but I'll read it. And then, they call me or they write me like, "Oh, it turns out I'm lonely." Because
Yeah.
we didn't necessarily know how to recognize it. And sometimes we put it in like even my addiction. Like I saw more of my addiction. It was only when I was, sober and sort of like doing my own inventory, realizing, oh, the loneliness is actually really a deep factor of this whole thing. Did that answer your question?
It did. And I think incredibly, we only have a couple minutes left. And again, I'm sorry for the technical difficulties at the top, but there's a question that just came in. I think this is a good way to end, I think, hopefully on a more positive note. But a big theme of the book is that loneliness can be a catalyst of creativity and how each of the different figures that you chronicled were able to do that. But there's a question that came in from the audience about how have you been able to, manage your loneliness and avoid relapse? Or what are some of the tricks that you've been able to kind of take loneliness and not lead you back down that path?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like well for me knowing that those things are connected was for me a huge thing. And that's why that learning that oh, I was using drugs and alcohol to like how to fight against that loneliness. I mean, I think that like some of it is, continually um and this is maybe, like this is sort of down the road a bit. Like it wouldn't be the first thing I would turn to in terms of like thinking about loneliness, but like figuring out what I need. I mean, I think that like loneliness is itself a possibility for self-awareness. And it
Mhm.
says, I don't have something in my life. That's why I have this. And so that like what I found is that really looking at my loneliness, I started to realize the things that I need. And, and it isn't necessarily just like one thing. Like I have a great marriage. But it doesn't do like I still will like for instance that I still feel lonely even in a great marriage means that like no one else is going to necessarily complete me. Even if the person who most can doesn't means that okay, that is a natural longing.
Mhm.
And so that, and sometimes just to be okay with that kind of longing is one thing. Another thing is to say, well, what can I make from this? What is something that in being creative, we're both expressing our loneliness, but wanting to share it with someone else. And you have to know what connects with other people in order to really open up to them. Like, so like even Zoom, like this, I'm very happy for this occasion, but it's for me, it's strange. Like I see Dan
Mhm.
and, but I know there are other people there, but I can't see them. So I can't necessarily know, I can't inflect my language. And so I just have to sort of like say, I can't be hyper vigilant in the, like the best sense of that, but I can just say like, well, if I just speak from the heart and say, this is what I feel and this is what I mean. And again, like, uh, and own it and be okay with it, that actually help. Like, it's not like hiding from the pain. It's realizing it's just a part of that being human,
Mhm.
which sounds easy, but like to really have that like trickle down, like that takes time.
Yeah.
And like I said, looking for okay, the bottom line is I find comfort in other people saying I feel alone.
Mhm.
Um, and and I think that's part of it. And like if you know that the struggle isn't going to go away, but you're not struggling alone, no matter what it is. Like
Mhm.
that really matters to me. And it matters to me, like even when I was getting sober, to like look over and see other people, like this. I remember being early on and this woman, and I was like, 22, and this woman was 72. And I said something, and she came over to me and said, "That's exactly my story." And then some other guy, like had a different life than, but said everything. I was like, oh my God, that's me. And like they didn't solve my problem. They didn't take the addiction away, but it meant like, oh, other people are doing this. And if they can do it and survive, then I can too. I mean, I think that's part of it. I mean, that seems maybe abstract and like, maybe the
Mhm.
better thing is to just like say I'm going to use this pain and write from it. I'm going to paint from it. I don't and just try to connect and not even care if I do, but just try. Like that opens you up, and when you're open, you can receive.
Yeah. Well, we this time flew by. Thank you so much, Richard, for sharing. I think that was a really some takeaways from your last answer of that self-reflection and that self-inventory of kind of yourself, understanding yourself as a way to manage loneliness, but also addiction. I think it's really powerful, and it's been such a pleasure having you on Monument Live today. Just a few final plugs because I want to make sure it got through to everyone. But You can visit richarddemingbooks.com to learn more about Richard's his books and everything that he's published. And if you're interested in checking out Monument, it's at joinmonument.com where you can learn more about our platform, what we offer. But this has been wonderful. Thank you again, Richard, for your time today and for sharing your story.
No, I really appreciate it. It meant a lot, Dan. This is really important to me, and it was, it's so much a part of my life that I'm always glad to help and reach out and be reached out to.
Yeah, thank you again, and appreciate everyone for joining. We'll be back with more Monument Live sessions in the months to come, but take care. Thanks again.
Ciao.